Banditos. It's Wednesday, so that means there's another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits coming right at you. But before we get to the full interview that is the Dollar Bin Bandits, let's get the intros out of the way. I am Joe Marcello.
I am Mike Farah.
Our buddy Oren is not here, but have no fear. We're going to soldier on without him and bring you some awesomeness nonetheless. And as always, let's not forget to thank our new sponsor, TwoMorrows Publishing. That's TwoMorrows.com, and all their fine publications. We are thrilled to be partnering with them, and we look forward to all the greatness that we have in store for the year to come. Today, we're bringing you our interview with a letterer. We haven't talked to a letterer in quite some time, but he does some great work. We're talking to none other than Richard Starkings. Now, you may be familiar with his work, his lettering, and work on Transformers, Spider-Man, Death's Head, and Dragon's Claws. Dragon's Claws. But more recently, he's worked on a pretty interesting book called Elephantmen. Had a chance to dive into that over the past year or so. And it's really quite an interesting book. Fun read. Definitely recommend checking it out.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with this interview. Rich is an interesting guy, had a varied career. He is probably most known as Joe referred to it, as a letterer and a font designer. And you can probably see his fonts all over the comic industry now. But we do get into his early career at Marvel UK, doing some work for Doctor Who, where he wasn't just lettering, but also doing some writing and editing. And then get into, his founding of Comicraft, which is a very well-known lettering and design agency that does work for all of the big publishers. And then, like Joe said, Elephantmen, which is kind of this sleeper hit that he writes and continues to write. It's a prequel to Flask, which was his first kind of foray into his own comics. And it's just a fascinating read. So definitely go out and get it. But enough of that. Let's get to the man himself. This is Richard Starkings. And today we are thrilled to have Richard Starkings as our guest. Richard, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure, as I said. So we start out with the same question for all our guests, and that is, how did you first discover comic books?
Well, I really can't remember not having access to comic books because I'm the youngest of four. So there were always comics being read in our house. My mum encouraged us to read, and she didn't mind what we read as long as we were reading. So the family got a magazine called Look and Learn, which had educational material, but it had Trigon Empire, which was an incredible comic strip by Don Lawrence. It's actually being collected by Rebellion, the publishers of 2000 AD. There's 4 volumes of the Trigon Empire available, and it's just absolutely gorgeous artwork. That's pretty much the only thing I read in Look and Learn. It was 2 pages every week. But it was science fiction, which is key for me. I didn't really realize it at the time. But there were other, juvenile comics. Comics in England were very much aimed at younger readers in general. Look and Learn was aimed at sort of 12 to 18-year-olds. And although I was aware of comics, the one that really got me hooked was a comic called Countdown, later TV action, because it featured science fiction TV tie-ins. And number 1 importance was Doctor Who. Number 2, UFO, and Thunderbirds and Stingray and all those Jerry Anderson serials. But looking back, I realized the quality of the artwork was just so high. It was beautifully painted, Winsor Newton inks, color inks. It's just absolute gorgeous because those artists were illustrators who came from illustration and advertising. It's not like it is now when people that read comics want to draw comics. It was a move in the world of illustration. So that artwork in those British weeklies was extremely illustrative. Ron Embleton, Michael Noble, these are all artists that most British creators my age, we go weak at the knees when we see that artwork. Don Lawrence, again, was working with Look and Learn. And yeah, so I think Countdown was the comic that made me love comics.
Do you still have any of that material?
Oh yeah, I have them all. And some of it's being reprinted, actually. Jerry Anderson's company, which is now run by Jamie Anderson, his son, they've recently collected UFO, and that's gorgeous artwork. They're great collections, hardcover collections, available from the Anderson site. I'm sure it's easy to find. Just Google Anderson UFO. And a lot of the Doctor Who material, because of course the interest in Doctor Who is endless. Some of that was collected in the 80s and 90s by Marvel Comics, what was then Marvel Comics, what is now Panini UK. Mm-hmm. So you know, that work is always at some point in print, because it's just, again, such high quality material, and Doctor Who fandom is insatiable.
Worth seeking out, for sure.
Definitely, yeah.
Now, when you transitioned from sort of fandom to a profession, or making comics a profession, it was in originally the discipline of lettering and fonts.
Yes and no.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes and no. So, and I should add a caveat to that, in that, you know, my oldest brother, Mel, he's 12 years older than me, and he had collected Eagle comic, which was, you know, 50s and 60s comic with, again, very high standards of illustration. Dan Dare was in that. You know, Dave Gibbons was a big fan of Dan Dare, and has illustrated it in 2000 AD. So Marvel UK started up in the early 70s with Mighty World of Marvel, and reprinted all the superhero strips. And I was about 11 or 12 when that stuff was being reprinted. My brother had a massive collection of American Marvel comics and DC comics, and I wanted to be on the same wavelength as him. So I started buying Mighty World of Marvel, and that's how I read all that early Stan Lee material, you know, the Jack Kirby stuff, the Steve Ditko stuff. I got to read it all from issue 1, so to speak, without having to pay for costly back issues, or hope that my brother would let me read his copies, which he later did when I was a bit more responsible. So I was reading Marvel UK, and of course it's all the superhero stuff. And I liked it because those 60s comics, the superhero comics, were based in science fiction, really. You know, radiation bomb, you know, science experiment with a spider. And the Fantastic Four is probably the most science fiction superhero comic out there, in that they're adventurers, you know, scientists, you know, there's mutation. Marvel is kind of rooted in science fiction, and that was what was attractive to me, rather than the superheroics. I wasn't a big fan of Superman. You know, I later learned to love Batman, but Marvel reprinting stuff in the UK pushed Marvel superheroes to the forefront. So I was reading those comics. I read hundreds of issues. I mean, you know, I think I stopped buying Mighty World of Marvel at issue 300 because it was weekly. So of course, you know, there's 50 issues a year. So 6-7 years I read those reprints. And that meant that I was aware that Marvel was making comics in England. Fast forward to graduated from college. I studied English and media studies. I wanted to get a job, but I was very determined to work in comic books. Warrior magazine, the birthplace of V for Vendetta and the temporary home of Marvel Man / Miracle Man, was being published in England. And that had the kind of content that I liked. And Alan Moore, of course, was writing 2 of those strips, if not 3. Captain Britain was coming out from Marvel UK. So I was very much aware that if I wanted to work in comics, I'd either go north to work for DC Thompson, which is a Scottish publisher of things like Beano and Dandy, comics that I'd never read, or I was going to work at 2000 AD or Marvel UK. And one day I was reading the Guardian newspaper and there was an ad for what we called an art assistant at Marvel UK. So I applied for the job, and I was working in publishing because Warrior had published an article about how to break into comics. And one of the suggestions was work in editorial or work as a lettering artist. So I was like, well, okay, so I'll apply to work in editorial at publishers. And I was working at a computer publishing company.
Sorry, I don't know that.
Sorry, that's my smart device.
Sensitive computer. Yeah.
Yes. So I started working at the National Computing Centre in Manchester, England, and I also worked at a company called Medicine down in London, because Marvel UK was based in London, 2000 AD, part of Fleetway was based in London. So I knew I had to live in London. So I got a job in London, finally, and applied for this job, got turned down for the job. But Ian Rimmer, who was the editor of Transformers UK at the time, asked me about my lettering skills, because I was lettering for a company called Harrier Comics, a sort of short-lived black and white comics company in England. And I was doing what they call, getting exposure. In other words, not being paid. But in a way, it did get me exposure. And I was working with some artists like Mike Collins, a British artist who's still working in comics today. He recently has been doing Doctor Who storyboards and a graphic novel about Apollo 11. Kev Hopgood, who, amongst his many sins, designed War Machine in Iron Man. And, it was a sort of young wave of creators. And Mike Collins was already working for Marvel UK and for 2000 AD. And I very shortly followed. I started doing freelance work for 2000 AD and lettering for Transformers at Marvel UK. And one day I went in to pick up a job, and I talked to Ian Rimmer, who was the editor, and said, "Did you fill that art assistant position?" And he went, "Wait." And he went into the managing director's office, came out and said, "Richard, have you got 5 minutes?" And talked to the managing director and started the next week. So just sort of knocking on the door, persistence, I got it to open. And also, having worked on my lettering skills, I picked up freelance, all in a very short period of time. And I became art assistant, which doesn't mean I work with an artist. It means I did design work on the weekly. So I was working on Spider-Man Comics Weekly, and later the Secret Wars reprint, which, we put out every 2 weeks, Secret Wars. And we started with Secret Wars and kept going with Secret Wars 2 and all the crossovers. A nightmare. But learning on my feet. So I did start working in comics via lettering, but I was very quickly doing design work, designing logos, lettering comic strips. I was lettering Doctor Who. I was lettering Transformers. And within a very short period of time, I was editing Action Force, which is G.I. Joe for British people.
Right.
So my intention was to work in comics. How I got in was through the back door, because I followed the advice of the Warrior article. And I definitely, I liked lettering. That was always something that was interesting to me. So it was an easy skill for me to pick up because I had the passion for it.
I was going, you sort of presumed my question, which was, even though you fell into lettering as a discipline and maybe even design, just by virtue of your trying to get into the comics industry, it seems like you ended up, to your point, liking the discipline. What was it about lettering, and also just in those days, obviously, was all hand lettering, that appealed to you, and that you sort of rode through even to the founding of your company, Comicraft?
I think realizing that the lettering was a key part of the artwork, and I always take exception to the term hand lettering because I still use my hands. It's never the tool, it's the artisan, and it's these, whether it's a mouse or a pen or an Apple Pencil, it's always the person controlling the tool. So, and I had to fight that fight. It's forgotten now because this was in the 90s. And I was famously told by the editor of X-Men, Bob Harris, you will never letter the X-Men with fonts, and within 2 years, we were lettering 17 X-Men books a month using fonts that we'd created. So I had to fight that fight. And now people say, wait, how did you letter comic books without fonts? Because it's 30 years since I made those breakthroughs now. And I had to learn how to make a font, find a program. I had to learn the program without a manual. I had to sort of break down editors' reluctance, and that took a long time. Luckily, I had John Rochelle, who's an exceptional font designer and just a Renaissance man. He can build or make anything, and he loved fonts more than I do. So we started, basically digitizing the styles that I had. And then we went beyond that and we created fonts in the style of Tim Sale, Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolland, anyone that was interested in that sort of evolution of the technology. Dave Gibbons, has always been at the forefront. Dave and Brian have both worked digitally for a lot longer than most artists because they were interested in the new tool. So yes, I worked as a pen letterer. I got ink on my hands. I used brushes and rotring pens and nibs, you name it. And it was interesting to me. Firstly, there was a comic strip in England called The Perishers. And the best way to describe that is Peanuts, UK. But the level of illustration was higher. It was much more illustrative. There was more to the drawings. And I remember noticing things about the lettering in The Perishers. And I did a Doctor Who newspaper style strip for various fanzines in England. And I learned how to letter by drawing my own newspaper style strips and lettering them and sort of looking at The Perishers and seeing how cleverly balloons would overlap, and that, you know, a lightning tail would indicate anger, and that everything could be drawn, every sound effect conveyed emotion that was an interesting drawing in and of itself. So I approached lettering through drawing letters, you know, while I was drawing this Doctor Who comic strip. And I was a big fan of Warlock. I'm looking over here because I have a spinner rack with all the issues of Warlock that Jim Starlin wrote and drew. And there was a letterer on that called Tom Ozakowski. And his contribution was really sort of intrinsic to my enjoyment of that comic book. There was a style that was very clean and easy to read, but also had a design element to it. The title pages were attractive to look at. The thought balloons, the captions, everything was designed. So I wanted to do that. I wanted to make that kind of contribution to a comic book and feel that involved. So that's what led me, that was the attraction to lettering. And I would say, you know, I mean, I had to relaunch my career when I moved to America, because I had worked in editorial 4 or 5 years at that point, and I was still lettering a lot. But when I moved to America, they were like, well, who are you? You know, and even though editors at Marvel knew me, because editors in New York would come and visit us in London, and would visit them. And I had been to San Diego for the first time in 1988. I think I went to New York in 87. We were launching a new comic book in American format called Dragon's Claws. So we were sent to New York to get feedback from Ralph Macchio, Mark Grunwald, Tom DeFalco. So we were the sort of punk ass kids from London who were encroaching on Marvel US territory, but they tolerated us because we were doing science fiction, because that was interesting to us. The market in England was open to science fiction because of 2000 AD, which was the biggest selling comic book in England at the time, and was always the one to beat. Sometimes Transformers outsold 2000 AD, sometimes not. And we were doing a sort of grim and gritty British science fiction comic. So we got a lot of feedback, a lot of interest, and I got to know those personalities. You know, Jim Shooter had been over in the mid-80s to tell us what we were doing wrong. And we listened because we were part of Marvel. We were part of that world. So I'd been there in 88. I quit my job at Marvel UK in 89 and moved to New York. I didn't have a green card or a work permit at that time. But Mark Grunwald kept offering me a job. He kept saying, as soon as you've got a green card, and the vicious circle, you know, catch 22 was, you need a job to sponsor you for a green card.
Right.
Can't get a green card until you've got a job. So that didn't happen. And I moved out to California and continued to do freelance pen lettering for Marvel US. And cut a long story short, that grew when I started doing digital lettering. And I developed a studio. I hired John Rochelle, who worked digitally with me, and we spent 3 years convincing editorial at DC and Marvel to let us use our fonts. And the happy ending to that story is we won. We broke them down. And of course, now everything is lettered digitally in the style that we created. And most people use fonts that we've created. We have the largest library of comic book fonts in the world. We have over 300 font families, and we see our fonts everywhere.
And so that was the genesis of Comicraft, that studio that you started.
Yes. Well, one day, so John had been working for me a couple of months, and one day he said, "How shall I answer the phone?" And I had a roommate in Venice Beach called Griff, and he was a carpenter, and he had a little business card, and it said Proudcraft. And I was like, "Oh, I wish I'd thought of that." And literally, when John asked me, "How shall I answer the phone?" I was like, Proudcraft, Comicraft. That's it. That was quick. I mean, I didn't know he was going to ask me how to answer the phone. I didn't know I needed a business name. I just put those two things together, and that was it.
I mean, I remember growing up at that time period and seeing Comicraft as probably the only other company I knew other than Marvel and DC, because I saw it so often.
Yes,
as the lettering credit.
Ubiquitous.
Yes.
Yeah.
You were. And I mean, you guys really hit it out of the park.
Because there was nobody prepared to, there was a lot of, I won't say hatred. There was a lot of nervousness amongst pen letterers, because, once we got our fonts to a certain high quality, and, what I had learned in editorial was, number one is turnaround time, because there are two things that matter in comics: time and money, right? Like any entertainment industry, whether it's movies, TV, or comics, it's always, can you save time? Can you save money? So I knew that the most important thing to editorial, having worked in editorial, was getting the work in on time. And I was pretty slow as a pen letterer. I wasn't as slow as other letterers, but I knew I had to be able to do a book in a day. I couldn't do it by myself, but I could do it with assistants and fonts. And that's exactly what I did. So there was a point, I remember I did the math. I think we were lettering 80% of Marvel's output in like 1998. And we were working for Acclaim/Valiant. And we were doing 7 or 8 books of DC. So we were sometimes doing 50 books a month. And I had 15 people working in the studio. And I was quality control. So I was doing all the title pages. I was setting up the style. JG was making different fonts. We were doing design at that point. We were doing logo design. We were doing Marvel's trade paperback program. We were designing every single trade paperback put out by Marvel in 5 years, because back then, late 90s, there weren't that many Marvel trade paperbacks. DC was ahead of the curve on trade paperbacks.
Yep.
So there was a lot of work. We had a great reputation, and writers and artists started asking for us, because they knew that we would bring a different look to each book. So we got onto Generation X, which was a big comic book title at the time. It was a big launch for Marvel. Our neighbors, Electric Crayon, my friends Mark Siri and Steve Bucellado, had formed a coloring company. We were in the same studio space, divided by a door. They had their side, we had our side. But we worked together, and they colored Generation X, and we did the lettering. And we sort of created, that was the first time I was nominated for an Eisner, was Generation X, because what we were doing was so unique. We didn't win the Eisner because we were the computer guys. Right. And that sort of generation didn't want to applaud what we were doing. And that was when we were doing the best work. We did Generation X, we did Danger Girl, we did Battle Chasers, Red Star. And it was a really exciting time, because all these image books were exploding. People like J. Scott Campbell and Joe Madureira were bringing in a different look, a little bit Disney, a little bit video game, a little bit manga. And that was when I really enjoyed our work at Comicraft, because we felt like part of a movement of younger you know, and I feel funny saying about that now, younger, cutting edge, you know, what can we do with this? We've got computers. What can we do with the coloring? What can we do with the lettering? What can we do with the design of the book? Because creators had more control because everything could be done on the computer, you know. So that sort of period where our work on Generation X and, you know, other Marvel and DC titles, we worked on the Heroes Reborn, and we worked on Heroes Return, and we had a real involvement. It felt like we were part of the team, which is what I'm always looking for, is to be part of a team, because when you're just a hired hand, it's too easy to phone it in. And if you do a good job, that doesn't necessarily mean you're valued, you know. But when somebody comes to you, like J. Scott Campbell came to me with Danger Girl and said, I really want this to stand apart. And then Joe Madureira came to us with Battle Chasers, and then Chris Gossett and Red Star. You know, when you're part of the team, and I would say the most rewarding team I work with is Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. You know, Tim passed away last year. I worked with him for 25 years. He became my closest friend, and working together was effortless because we were so in sync, you know. And so, you know, I was giving him feedback as if I was the editor, and I wasn't the editor. I just loved Tim's work, and I loved working with him. And I got to work on Daredevil Yellow, Spider-Man Blue, Hulk Gray, Captain America White, Batman The Long Halloween, Superman for All Seasons, Superman Kryptonite, Grendel. You know, Tim was popular in independent comics. He was popular in DC Comics, and he was popular in Marvel Comics. And I was along for that ride, you know. And in fact, we did a book together, Tim Sale Black and White, because we used to have very long phone calls. And when he told me that he didn't really start working comics till his late 20s, I was like, that's really encouraging. You were working at a mom and pop store, a grocery store, and Taco Time in Seattle until your late 20s. And that's when you started drawing. People need to hear that. People need to know you don't need to go to art college straight away. He did go to the Buscema School for a year in New York. But, you know, young people need to know that you don't have to hit the ground running and start working for the major comics publishers. You can do Thieves World, you can do Grendel, you can do drawings of unicorns at comic conventions, as Tim did, and you can, you know, end up on Batman and Superman.
And it's easier than ever to take that route and either self-publish or go with an indie publisher.
It is easier than ever. It's still difficult to get a hit.
Sure.
I mean, you know, even Robert Kirkman, who had 2 big hits, hasn't seemed to be able to pull another one out of the hat, because you could be Robert Kirkman and still not know why those 2 books were massive and the last 2 were not. Right. You know, everybody's trying to get the Saga. You know, who'd have thought Saga would have been Image's next big hit? Right. So it is easier, but there's also way more ways to be an artist in comic books these days. You know, firstly, you have a lot of young people that were reading manga in the 90s and noughties, and that's their touchstone. Marvel and DC, forget it. They want to do manga in the American market, or work with that vibe. Miyazaki is more influence over the last 20 years of comics than Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. You know, there are young people that just sell prints of Miyazaki characters. You know, Totoro, you know, Kiki's Delivery Service. And there is this whole sort of change to the look of comics that even Marvel and DC have embraced. There's always a traditional looking Batman, there's always a traditional looking Superman, but there's all these other influences seeping in, whether it's Peach Momoko on Marvel variant covers or interiors, or these younger artists that are not looking at 1960s comics and trying to recreate that vibe. They are looking at the comics that they loved. It could be Death Note, it could be Fruits Basket, whatever they were attached to as comic book readers, sitting cross-legged in Borders books in 2003, reading manga off the shelf because they couldn't afford to buy it. That reminds me of the days when I would read a comic at the store because I couldn't afford to buy more than the other three. And there's an entry level to comics now where you can read comics for free. So what influences you is the free comics, or you're on Comixology Unlimited or some other digital platform where you can read everything, and we generally gravitate to the things we feel comfortable with.
Yeah, or you're at the library, where my daughter, who's 9, is discovered and loves comics, and it's just brought in the influences from so many different areas, and the approaches has brought in a whole new audience, because you're not concentrating on just one sort of tradition. You have various influences, and so there's a diversity of titles and therefore a diversity of audience, which I think benefits the entire industry.
And don't forget that the industry now is dominated by manga. I mean, globally, manga outsells superheroes 10 to 1. So, this idea of the comic book industry as a superhero comic book industry is dated. And, one of the things that I realized when I created my own comic book was, I'm not interested in doing a superhero comic. I'm interested in doing a science fiction comic, because that's what I loved when I was reading comics. So whatever it is that you love when you're reading comics is what you recreate. Right, it's always a love letter to yourself. The successful comics. Robert Kirkman loved Walking Dead. He loved zombie movies, and he loved Spider-Man comics. But he was a late reader in Spider-Man. What he thinks of as the beginning of Spider-Man is not what I think of as the beginning of Spider-Man. Right. And now people think that Miles Morales is the beginning of Spider-Man, or Spider-Gwen is the beginning of Spider-Man. So, which is very healthy. And those are some of the influences that I think are vital. But Sergio Aragonés, the creator of Gru, and a contributor to Mad Magazine in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, he said to me something interesting once. He said, people don't want to read humor in comic books anymore because you can turn on the TV and sitcoms are on all the time. And animated shows, Simpsons, Family Guy, all these things are on TV. So why would you read a humor comic book if the humor is there in animated form on TV all the time? I think the same is happening with superheroes. Why would you read superhero comics if you can turn on Disney and watch superhero TV shows and movies for 3 weeks uninterrupted? Right. And what I've noticed is a lot of young people, and when I say young people, I mean people in their 20s and 30s. During the pandemic, my massage therapist was watching the Marvel, the MCU movies in order on Disney Plus. My acupuncturist was reading them in order on Disney Plus, and my personal trainer was reading them watching them in order on Disney Plus. Because during the pandemic, couples were at home and the guys were saying, let's watch an MCU movie, and so now, young women in their 30s know who Captain America is and about his disagreement with Iron Man. And they know about Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet, which I thought only me and 5 other people knew about the Infinity Gauntlet.
Right.
So you have this sort of movement where superheroes dominate movies and TV. Superheroes / Star Wars are dominating, but young people are always attracted to the thing that their parents are not aware of. And that to me is interesting and exciting. What are they doing? All these things that are pouring in. George Lucas liked Flash Gordon, the Old Republic serial, so he came up with Star Wars and Indiana Jones. So the people that like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Family Guy and Miyazaki, what are they making, having all those influences pour into you? And for me, I made Elephantmen because I love Blade Runner, Doctor Who, Fantastic Four. My parents used to visit Africa every year, so my home was filled with African memorabilia, meaning elephants, hippos. You know, this was not lost on me when I went back to my parents one time and I looked around. I was like, oh, this is why I came up with Elephantmen. You know, it's just, I was immersed in that. I was immersed in comics. I was immersed in science fiction movies. So what do I create? Something that borrows from everything. I think that's what's interesting now is what people in their 20s and early 30s are making, because it'll be new, you know. And yes, the top talents will get snatched up by Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, etc. But hopefully in the process, all these new ideas will come in the way that, you know, Jeff Lemire had fresh ideas. Scott Snyder has fresh ideas. They're a generation a little bit behind me. I'm interested in what the generation a little bit behind them. That's what's going to be exciting.
Agreed. You already touched on this, but I wanted to dive a little bit more into your specific creation, which is Hip Flask, and then of course Elephantmen. You know, the story is that Hip Flask was born of necessity. As you're launching your company, you needed something to show off the fonts and how that they would work and interact with comic book characters. Did you always somewhere have that character in sort of your back pocket, or was it really just kind of almost spur of the moment?
It was,
I'm going to make a hippo character and it will be sci-fi.
Yeah. So I was drawing a comic strip for a local newspaper in El Segundo called Hedge Backwards. And it was basically me in El Segundo having a Brit living in America. And it was just a little newspaper strip. So having done the Doctor Who newspaper style strip for various fanzines, I then did something at college called Then Again, which was just about all my student friends. And then I moved to America and I had this Real Ghostbusters annual that was a dummy copy with blank pages in. And I would just doodle in that with a ballpoint pen. And one day I just drew this character who was sort of materializing out of thin air saying, "Who am I?" And he became Hedge Backwards. My mum used to say to me, "You look like you've been pulled through a hedge backwards," when I used to come in from playing next door. And I realized that was sort of me. I was able to write a comic strip a little bit about my first year or so in America. And it didn't really go anywhere. And also I started having disagreements with the editor of the newspaper about what would be in the strip, because she wanted it to be more wholesome, I think. And I was drawing the world around me. I had, you know, roommates who had bongs in the house and, you know, lived in squalor. And I think she wanted something a little bit more, you know, family sitcom. So I stopped drawing that. But when we started selling the fonts, I talked to Marvel about using the X-Men to promote my fonts. I talked to Jim Lee about using Wildcats to promote our fonts. And of course, they didn't really know what fonts were or what their value was. So I was like, okay, well, I have a character, Hedge Backwards. I'll write a story that uses the fonts. And I remember it was going to be called Sound Judgment because sounds would be involved so I could show off sound effects. And then I just realized that I was forcing, you know, I was like, well, I don't letter my newspaper style strip with fonts. I letter adventure comic strips with fonts. So I should create an adventure character. And I had this name Hip Flask, who I thought would be a private detective, and I was like, well, that's something I could do. But it wasn't enough that he was a private detective. And from Hip Flask, I was like, well, he's a hippo. And then my science fiction brain kicked in, and I was like, well, if he's a hippo, he's not goofy. He's not, a Disney character. He's not anthropomorphic. A lot of people say, oh, you have an anthropomorphic hero. No, he's half human. So he's not imitating human traits. Mickey Mouse is a cipher for a human character, right? And Donald Duck is it, they're just, they're animals as human beings. So I then decided his arch foe would be a rhino. And then I was like, well, that's another African animal. So they must have been created in Africa. And then I came up with the super soldier, which, I've read superhero comics all my life. Of course, they're super soldiers. And then I realized, well, this is pretty much my version of the Thing, who's my favorite Marvel character. I love in the Thing, this man, this monster, kind of conundrum that he wants to be human, but he's afraid that they only love him. Alicia only loves him
as
he's
the monster.
The monster, I love that conundrum in Fantastic Four. I love that character, who's a very likable character. So, I came up with Hip Flask, and I changed it later to Elephantmen because people would either say Hip Flash, or they'd say, what's Hip Flask? And why is, they couldn't get their head around it. And I came up with the name Elephantmen for the second issue, and Bob Harris called me and said, that's it, Elephantmen. I was like, well, if the editor of the X-Men thinks Elephantmen's a good idea, I'll go with it. So Hip Flask and Elephantmen is the same comic. Hip Flask refers to a mini series that I did with Ladrone, which he's still working on. He's going to finish it soon. But as soon as I was approached by Image to bring it to Image, and I launched it as an ongoing as Elephantmen. And I wouldn't say I had it in my back pocket. I would say that what I had in my back pocket was years of experience and, working with people like Simon Furman on Transformers, Jeff Loeb on all the books I've worked on with Jeff, which is a truckload, because he worked on the X-Men books. He worked on Fantastic Four. I learned a lot about pacing comics, and I'd already written comics at Marvel. I've written a Transformers, a G.I. Joe. I've written Doctor Who, Real Ghostbusters. Anything I worked on, I tried to write at least one issue to see what the problems were and to see what the writer's guide should be about. So I knew I could write a comic. I was worried that I couldn't write in an American style, but many people meet me and they're surprised I'm English. So that was a non-obstacle. And I've written over 100 issues of Elephantmen at this point. So, what I had in my back pocket was every comic I'd ever read. I studied English. I'd studied, how to write a story. I'd read aspects of the novel. I read about the mechanics. I was always more interested in the comics journal than in comics, in a way. I loved reading the interviews. Way back when I used to study any Frank Miller interview, any Alan Moore interview, anything, any little gem you can learn. And working on the front line, seeing art and script come together in lettering is a great way of learning how comics work. So, and even today, when I think I've got quite proficient at it, and I understand how you can write not really knowing where you're going, because I know so many of the people I work with make it up as they go along. Stephen King, if you've read On Writing by Stephen King, he doesn't know where he's going to end up when he starts out. Russell T. Davies wrote a great book about writing Doctor Who. I think that's called Writing Doctor Who. He throws all the balls in the air.
Right.
And one good tip I got from his book was he thinks that the last 5 minutes of the story, the ending, should be obvious in the first 5 minutes of the story. So you'll get 30 minutes into a script and think, how am I going to end this? And then he rereads the first 5 minutes and goes, there it is. And that really works because your subconscious is always planting ideas and you have to then pick up on your own ideas. Because once you've learned the format of a comic book, the rhythm of a story, I know that, David Bowie used to just walk into a recording studio with nothing written down and start riffing vocally,
right,
just saying things and eliminating some and bringing new ones in. I mean, who knows what life on Mars is about? But what we do know is that when life on Mars is on, you sit and listen and you're stirred by, these things. Mickey Mouse has grown up a cow. What does that mean? But it doesn't matter because it's the music, it's the emotion and the rhythm. And I think that when you've been working in comics a while, you sort of internalize that. And I'm much more confident now that when I get to issue 4 of 5, that I'm going to make the ending. I'm going to land it because I know how I'm throwing the balls in the air, and I know that one's coming down in a second. I have to catch it over here, and this one over there. So that's what I have in my back pocket is sort of muscle memory,
Right.
And I think, when I started, I was a bit worried, and I worked with Joe Casey on the first issue and a half of Hip Flask, and I realized he was going in a different direction, and he had rules that didn't apply to me. So I started writing it myself because it's easier than struggling with somebody else to get them to write what you want them to write. And I had plotted it. I had, I worked with Ladrone on what it would look like, and then bringing Joe in, he had a flatter tone. I'm much more emotional, and he's a little bit more controlled. So that was a good learning experience too. Oh, I have a voice. I know what I'm looking for.
The way you explain it, it seems like now the most natural thing in the world. Back then, having created a character pretty much out of thin air to sell fonts, did you ever think for the life of you that you'd be writing a series of books with
25 years
that's 25 years later that's have spun out of this.
I did. There was 2 moments. One was I would like to write at least 4 issues of my own comic book, and that'll be fine. Then I'll be happy. And that's Hip Flask, and we're still waiting on issue 5. But I did write those first 4 issues. But then when Image approached me and I decided I wanted to do a prequel, it's a 100-issue prequel to a 5-issue series. I thought, well, no, I can't. I'll do a one-shot with 48 pages and do 8-page stories with, what's 48? 9 artists. I was going to just do short stories. So if you look at the early issues of Elephantmen, there are some short stories. I worked with Tom Scioli on one, Henry Flint from 2000 AD on another. And I met this artist, Moritat, who had drawn a graphic novel that I published, Steve Siegel's Solstice. And I loved his artwork, and he was very fast. So I thought, well, I'll work with him. And then suddenly I had more ideas than I knew what to do with. And I thought I could do 12 issues. I thought I could do 6. At first, I thought I could do 48 pages, which is 2 issues. Then I was like, I could do 6 issues of short stories. And then once I got to issue 6, once you've got the ball rolling, you've got the law of cause and effect working in your favor, that a character will do something that you then have to follow up on, or a character will have to explain something in the form of a story that you thought didn't need explaining. You know, you're basically, when you create a world, which is what Elephantmen is, it's a world building comic, right? You have to explain the world to people reading it. And I've written issues recently, 100 issues after the fact, that I thought I would have explained 80 issues ago, but you get sidetracked in a good way. So what are the story possibilities with Elephantmen? Well, they're hated and feared. That's X-Men, basically. But, okay, who loves them? Who hates them? Who's killing them? Which ones are fighting with each other? What happens if another country has their own transgenics, which is China, and they have tiger transgenics? So the story starts to unravel for you because you're sort of pulling on the thread, and I have found myself starting a story where I realize, oh, I've written that one already. I'm just coming at it from a different character's point of view. But I think, there's a great documentary about Quincy Jones. Listen Up, The Lives of Quincy Jones. Have you seen that? Very
I've not seen it. I've heard of it, though.
Oh, look it up. He says, only begin and the mind grows heated. Only begin and the task will be completed. And I think his mother used to tell him that. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, you just got to start. Right. You've got to start, and then you've got to continue. And there's another thing I'm always telling people. I can't remember where I got this from, but it's the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And I get very distracted with all the projects we work on. I have 2 guys that work for me full time on lettering and design, but I'm always involved at some level. And that can mean, Axel's drawn 6 pages of an issue that I've been writing, and I haven't written anything for 2 months because I've been dealing with everything else. One of which is, wrapping up. I'll show you. This isn't recorded visually, is it?
It is, but we can cut it out.
Well, you can also post images on the site, I guess. But, we've got 2 books coming out from Dark Horse, Ask for Mercy. Wow. 2 thick volumes from Dark Horse this year. And this is all the original stuff, the Comixology originals. 2 thick volumes of Elephantmen coming from Dark Horse. So, I've gone from Image to Comixology originals to Dark Horse with 1 project, Elephantmen. And we'll probably be self-publishing. We do print on demand volumes of Elephantmen. I'm repackaging them as 5-issue collections instead of 7 or 8 issue collections. And you can order them from Amazon. One is Man-Made Monsters. The other is War Toys. There's 2 War Toys, 1 and 2. So there's 3 books where you can order them from Amazon on, let's say, Thursday. They're printed on Friday and they arrive on Saturday. And that's the future. I like to be at the cutting edge. I like to do digital lettering when nobody else is doing it. I like to be at Comixology Originals when nobody else was doing it. Ask for Mercy and Elephantmen were the first launches from Comixology Originals. Elephantmen was also one of the first books, if not the first book, on Comixology when they launched.
I remember that.
Because they used issue 1 to show everybody else what guided view would look like. And because of my experience with selling fonts, digitally, there's always another market. You're not eating up your own market. We still letter comic books, even though we've sold thousands and thousands of fonts. People still want to come to Comicraft for what we bring to the table. So when Comixology started talking about doing originals, I was in Chicago, I think, with Chip Mosier and David Steinberger, and they mentioned it. I said, come to me first. When you're doing digital comics, I want to be on that launch platform. And amazingly, we didn't just do one, we did two. We did Ask for Mercy and Elephantmen in the first wave of originals. And we just wrapped up season 4 of Ask for Mercy, season 4 of Elephantmen. And I'm sort of done with it now anyway, because I just want to do it direct, or I want to try Kickstarter, because I'm always interested in what you can learn with a new publisher format, print on demand. You know, print on demand, the quality is so high now. You wouldn't know it was printed individually on a machine at Amazon in Massachusetts or somewhere. North Carolina, I think mine come from. You can always tell when something's printed on demand because there's a little barcode in the back. Whoa, that fell. That's not the right one. So you print it, and there's a barcode here. And then it tells you, sorry, I'm showing you, I'll just tell the listeners that in the inside back cover, the last page, there's a barcode and it tells you the date and where it was printed. This one is in Columbia, South Carolina.
Yep.
And I love that, you know, these books are printed wherever you are in the world. So if somebody in Australia wants to buy one of our new Elephantmen Man-Made Monsters trade paperbacks, it's available on Amazon Australia or the UK or India or anywhere they have Amazon. So it's constantly in print. And, you know, I'm at the age where I want to preserve my heritage, right?
Your legacy.
My legacy. Thank you. And what's better than something always being available, print on demand? And I've realized since getting into that field, whenever I get a book from Amazon now, I always look in the back to see if it's print on demand, because it doesn't tell you. It doesn't say this is printed on demand. It just says this is a book. And there are a lot of books out there that are kept in print that way. You'd be surprised.
Well, I'd imagine they don't want anybody to necessarily know, because it should be indistinguishable, right?
Which it is. And you're right. Why does it matter? It doesn't matter.
I mean, it would to you, because you're, I think, steeped in the production process and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, like a lot of things in comics and probably Hollywood, is that the less you see of the magic, the better. The
Keebler elves.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, so that's all. It's always interesting to me. I like a certain amount of lawlessness, because you can make up the rules as you go along, and you can say, well, wait a minute, why can't I do that? Can I do that? You know, and that's the nice thing about Kickstarter. That's sort of breaking down a lot of people's expectations as to what you can afford. And the fact that there's a market out there. I just signed up for a statue of Strontium Dog at Kickstarter.
Mm-hmm.
And they only needed 120 backers, you know, which is nothing.
Sure.
You know, so now I get a Strontium Dog statue that is high quality. Strontium Dog being one of my favorite characters in 2000 AD, just in case nobody knows that.
Yeah.
You know, so there's, you know, I think we're in an exciting time in that, number one, there's tons of comics being produced. There's a lot of merchandise, way too much, actually. You have to really specialize so you don't go broke. And there's lots of different ways of making comics available. You know, Elsa Chartier did a hardcover sketchbook, and, you know, it overfunded. So she did a commentary edition of November. I've got them. I'm looking over here because they're over there. And then she did a comic book with her partner, Pierrick, which was done in Inktober, I think. And they did a different prompt every day, but the same story. And the Kickstarter was a little hardcover of the color comic, and then a process trade paperback of how they came up with the story and the little sketches and things. And it's almost like it's an experiment, it's like this is a brand new comic, and they're delivering all these little goodies as part of your Kickstarter package. No publisher in their right mind would do that. This is what you were saying earlier about how easy it is to be an independent publisher, whether you're doing a Kickstarter or you're just doing a small 500 print run of a little mini comic. What's really interesting is when you go to these shows, go to the Artist Alley. I went to Emerald City Artist Alley last year, Seattle, and it had exploded. There were so many creators there. It wasn't recognizable to me. And I was with Ian Churchill and other Marvel alumni from the 90s.
I remember.
And he was saying, I just don't recognize it. I don't know anybody here. And I was like, that's what's exciting. We don't know who they are, and we gravitated towards Daniel Warren Johnson, who had just done his Beta Ray Bill, and he does these wrestling comics, and he had these mini comics. And I was like, he has little Star Wars inspired mini comics and a little wrestling comic, something else. And he's able to do that. Somebody who's now, a big name Marvel creator, DC creator. He did a Wonder Woman graphic novel. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Really great stuff. And he's doing little mini comics and a Blade Runner print, or, all these little goodies. Back in the day, people did sketches for $20, or free. In England in the 80s, it was always for free. Nobody wanted to charge for a sketch. It wasn't until those greasy-handed Americans came over with their charging for sketches,
right,
that the Brits started saying, I wonder if we should be doing that, and then eBay came along, and it became, of course
industry. Yeah.
So I think it's really exciting to see all these new avenues that can be explored in comics. It's an embarrassment of riches.
Agreed. I think it is a fascinating time for the comics industry, and I think the consumers, the readers, are benefiting from it all, and we just get to sort of bask in whatever content is being produced, and all kinds of content is being produced.
I'm just looking at my little video here, and I'll explain what I'm pointing to. See over here, there's a Conan illustration. Yes. So during the pandemic, I decided I wanted to commission some artists to do drawings of whatever kind, because I never do that. But, I was in lockdown. And there's this artist, Rob de la Tour, who draws like he's the reincarnation of John Buscema. And people were commissioning him to do Conan illustrations. So I got him to recreate two of my favorite covers. One is Conan, I think one's 44 and one's 88. I can't remember which, but one is Conan and Red Sonja on a skull. And the other one is Bailey and Conan and Zuma. And now he's drawing Conan, right, for Heroic Signatures and Titan. And I like to think I played a part in that, because commissioning an artist to draw something, and then lots of other people commissioning that artist, raised his visibility, and they had to go and get him. Yep. And the moment I found out he was drawing Conan, I wrote to Heroic Signatures and said, I would love to letter that book, because it feels to me like, wow, it's as close as I could get to lettering Conan by John Buscema, which was one of my favorite comic books when I was a teenager. So it's nice to see fresh talent. And I don't think he's young. He's in Spain. But he's someone we haven't seen before. And through the power of the internet, through Facebook, he's created this following that has sort of propelled him onto the book that some would say he was born to draw.
Agreed. I mean, it's just another example of, how the embarrassment of riches you were talking about. Yeah.
World of possibilities. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I think it's been a fascinating interview. I'd love to hear all your perspectives on all this great stuff. Sometimes, we tend to get, well, you are a writer and an artist in your own right, but those that have not done as many things as you have done within the industry, and you get obviously sort of kind of siloed views of certain things, but I love hearing, the different angles and thought processes that go into your work and your fandom even. So let me ask you, for those who want to follow your work, see what's coming next, what's down the line, where can fans go? Social media accounts, websites, what have you?
Yeah, I'm Rich Starkings on Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, Richard Starkings. Very easy to follow me on those accounts. We have an Elephantmen Facebook page. We have an Ask for Mercy Facebook page. You can follow me on Amazon. I have an author page. I'm more active on Facebook, but I tweet, I Insta. I do all those things the kids are doing. The thing that I would say is that, Elephantmen has definitely been the work of my life. And it's very easy to get copies on Amazon. I don't care if you get them used like new, brand new, print on demand. But it's something that I'm really confident that people will enjoy, especially if you like science fiction, if you like Fantastic Four, if you like Blade Runner, if you like Planet of the Apes, all the things that I like. But it is also unique, and Ask for Mercy is a project I never thought I would do a second project and enjoy as much. But I'm working with Abigail Jill Harding, who's a young artist from England. And I'm editing her new project for Comixology Originals, which is Parliament of Rooks. And it's a gorgeous Gothic romance with men that transform into rooks and demons and darkness and Victorian mansions. So, look out for those. We have an Ask for Mercy Twitter. We have an Elephantmen Twitter. Dark Horse is publishing all these books this year. And I'm very grateful for them to doing that, because I'm not necessarily writing anything new this year, but it's going to look like I'm really prolific.
And welcome back. That was a great interview, Mike. And we didn't get a chance to really tee it up properly, but it was Mike on the mic, guys. Let's be real. Oren and I couldn't join for this one, but unfortunately, fortunate for us, Mike gave us another home run. But that being said, interesting career. You don't really think about people that create fonts and lettering. I mean, you just turn on Word and there's Helvetica and you hate it, and Times New Roman, and that's what everyone uses. But someone takes the time to design fonts. And that's pretty interesting work, because everyone's going to use it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that sets comics apart from other visual media. It's not just the fonts that you see in the dialogue and the thought bubbles, but it's stuff that is the sound effects, which really can, amp up a scene within the comics, and then how, the flow of the actual story. So great to hear about that. And his books, the books that he writes are just quite fascinating. I said it before. I'll say use that word again. So please look them up. As I said, Elephantmen continues to really rock the Image world, Image Comics, and take a look. And that will be it, I think, for this episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Richard Starkings for coming on the program. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.